Good afternoon, everybody, or morning as the case may be. Welcome to ARMA International's webinar, OMG, yes, retention management ROI is attainable. I'm Wendy McLean, incoming president-elect of ARMA International, and I will be your host and moderator for today's session. No, this is not a scary movie. This is me making do with the fact that the power has just gone off, but somehow I'm still connected. So bear with me as I get through a couple of announcements and then get this thing started. Today's webinar is sponsored by the folks at Access, and I'd like to thank the Access team for their time and their commitment to ARMA. It's because of their support that we're able to bring you programming like this. When considering new products and services, I hope that you consider the partners who support you. Before we get started, I do have a few announcements to share. For those of you who have attained your IGP, the Information Governance Professional Certification, today's webinar counts toward 1 continuing education credit. Now, if you haven't checked out your membership benefits lately, we are excited to offer online and virtual opportunities to connect and get resources through your membership. If you are not an ARMA professional member, as you can see, there are a lot of resources to take advantage of, and it's an affordable way to get resources as an information professional. More information about ARMA membership and getting started can be found on our website at arma.org. I want to take just a real quick moment to talk about ARMA InfoCon, live and in person. I, for one, can't wait to see you in Houston with over 60 education sessions, 5 keynotes, and several networking events. There's plenty to do. For those who can't travel, we will have a virtual option, and you can check out those details again at our website, arma.org. But I will be there, and I'll be looking for you. We also have member-only webinar series that are coming up on September 3rd with Louis Eisen. It's now open for registration. Look for an email invitation or find the details again on our website. So 1 or 2 more things before we get going. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions. That way our panelists will see them. And at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will send a link to the slides and a recording of the session in the next few days. So keep an eye on your inbox. So I am really excited to hear this presentation. I want to get down to it. Let me introduce my friend, John Isaza, VP Information Governance with Access, and my new friend, Marquis, Business Development Executive, Virgo, also with Access. Take it away, fellas.
John, you're on mute. Starting it off strong today.
I am starting off strong today. In fact, my monitor just died and I had to switch to my laptop. So now I look like I'm looking down at everybody, which is not really the way I like to work. And poor Wendy, she looks like she's coming in from the upside down. So if you want to know what the upside down is, just email us afterwards and we'll take you on that journey. So as some of you may know, I'm a practicing attorney, and I've been specializing in privacy, records, and information governance for a while. I'm on sabbatical from the practice of law right now because Access acquired a software that I developed called Virgo, which manages your global regulations around information governance and your repositories and your records inventory and your retention schedule in terms of the rules that are applied to all those different types of fields. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm actually delighted to present for the first time with Marquis here, who I met years ago when he was struggling as a trainer at an Equinox in Miami. And now he is co-presenting with me, and I'm actually very proud of him. And the bulk of the presentation today is actually his brainchild based on what he's heard from clients in terms of this OMG. It is possible that there is ROI with research and making your life more efficient. Tidan, tell us a little about yourself.
Thanks. It's hard to follow up on that introduction, so I appreciate it. As John mentioned, I'm John Marquis. I am a business development executive who oversees the Virgo product. I've been working with this team for 4+ years and in sales and marketing for roughly 10. I think as myself as more of a relationship manager, and a lot of the details that we're going to be discussing today help a lot of my customers not only understand the needs for a solution to address some of those pain points and challenges with records management, but also discussing some advantages of saving money and allowing the organization to have some ROI and some information around that. So hopefully the things that we'll present today will be of benefit to many of you in your conversations with your management teams, and we look forward to answering your questions either during the call or after the webinar.
I'm still dickering with trying to figure out how to get you guys a better angle here because for some reason my monitor decided to die on me. Maybe that's a little bit better right there.
There you go.
There we go. All right, so what are we going to cover today? We're going to just go over, what may seem a little bit obvious to some of the more seasoned records managers in the audience. But maybe for those of you that are newer to the industry, this will be a nice reminder of the retention compliance issues that are out there, which have become ever more complex with all the privacy requirements that are sort of almost in conflict with the retention requirements and the needs of your organization for retention. I do want to remind you to please submit questions, and we'll be submitting, and Wendy is going to be monitoring to see if we receive any questions from you. And of course, we'll try to save some time at the end to answer some questions as well. So in addition to the retention compliance issues, we'll be going over some key considerations. And then finally, we'll turn it over to Tidan, who's going to take us through the journey of how he came up with this cost analysis of retention schedule updates and doing a comparison of what it would cost for you to do this in-house versus outsourcing the heavy lift on some of that research and the management of your retention schedule. All right, beginning with the compliance aspect of it. This is just a smattering of the different types of regulatory requirements that are out there that are guiding us in our everyday retention decisions. And it goes back way before the 1960s, of course, but we're beginning with the 1960s. We've got, at the federal government, the Freedom of Information Act requests, which also we have at the privacy level. And there have been other major sort of legal initiatives over time that have really continued putting us as records and information governance professionals at the epicenter of the management of the family jewels of the organization, which is the information, which is the records of the information. And so along the way, there have been watershed moments in legislation such as HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, and more recently, GDPR and CCPA, which then has morphed into the CPRA out of California, all of which are now going from not just a focus on security requirements and protection of the data and retention of the data, but also now that there being a focus on disposition of the data as soon as you no longer need it to make sure that you don't have this data around to get you into trouble. So along with that comes this concept of, the judiciary sophistication, the policies and the procedures that need to be adapted or adopted to make sure that we're ready for reporting, that we're ready for monitoring and testing, that we're ready to produce evidence should it ever be required in the event of a legal hold. So all of that is part of the big information ecosystem that we have to build into our program. Tidan, anything you'd like to add on this before I move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I think it just, you make a lot of good points here, but one of the things I feel is an important topic to discuss here is that along with so many regulatory changes over many decades, on average, what we're really seeing with a lot of our customer bases is that domestic companies are subject to anywhere from 8,000 to 15,000 requirements on an annual basis. And most of our global customers are upwards of 30,000 or more. And we have some that actually have to subscribe to 100,000 citations because they're a really large, global, complex organization. And having a solution in place is the most efficient way to perform these updates, because otherwise you're going to be spending a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources to do this. And it's almost an impossible feat for a small team to perform. And otherwise, if you don't have a solution, you have to use the in-house legal team. You either have to outsource it or you have to do the work yourself, and searching Google for this information is not a very easy thing to do. So as we continue to talk about this, we'll kind of unravel some of these key features of the Virgo solution we're familiar with, but we'll discuss the additional considerations that you should also go into thinking about when you're looking into these.
Thank you, T-Don. So as we look at sort of preparing, and then we're calculating basically the ROI, and by the way, the genesis of this presentation, it really was that customers were asking T-Don all the time, hey, listen, I really want to go forward with what you guys are offering, but we need something that will resonate with the senior level of the organization. What's the ROI for what you've got? How do we prove to them the benefit of this? And when you walk out of the presentation today, you will have that ROI, some great examples of ROI. But before I digress, we have to stop and first realize, as T-Don just pointed out, that the research is at the core of this. Back in the maybe even in the 1950s and 60s, when ARMA was first created, a bunch of the time was actually spent uncovering all the laws and regulations around the United States, if not the globe, that dealt with the management of information. And we would have thought that, we used to say it's only 7 years as the retention, and that's the sort of the old wives' tale that you hear about the retention of how long you need to retain stuff. And it turns out that it's so much more complex than that. It's tied to triggering events, and it's tied to the different types of record, HR records that may have to be retained from termination of the employee plus 40 years after that. And all of that comes from existing laws, not just in the privacy space, as you see here with GDPR, CCPA, which are all focusing around privacy, but new laws that deal with enforcement. And new laws are coming out so regularly. It's kind of a constant deluge of changes in laws. I believe that we ran a calculation, and T-Don can keep me honest on this. It's almost like 200 updates a day in our database of laws that change in one way or the other. Now, they could be insignificant changes, like changing a little bit of the wording, but it could be significant changes, like the retention period could change, or the triggering event could change, or the scope of what's covered could change. So as you're tracking all this, you're not just tracking it at the state level and at the federal level within the United States, but if you have a geographic footprint outside of the United States, let's say Canada, you're tracking it in Canada at the provincial level, at the federal level, and then likewise in all the other countries around the globe. And as I mentioned, the trend continues. So things, as I mentioned, are at the risk of being repetitive, they are continuing to evolve on a daily basis. There are U.S. federal proposals for Consumer Online Privacy Rights and Consumer Data Privacy Act of 2020, which so far hasn't gone very far, but you never know. There are legislative cycles in 2020 and 2021. Although most of them have failed, 30 states have already addressed privacy. So those are, it's almost like this quilt that we're managing with all these different laws in all these different states that are disparate in their approaches depending on how strongly they feel about privacy. And then actually, if you dig a little bit deeper, there are certain states that are more fixated on certain issues, especially when it comes to privacy. Like Illinois, for example, is really fixated on biometric data, and they've got a lot of regulations that deal with the management of biometric data. or California has a more omnibus type of legislation around privacy. New York is trying to get on board with that. Texas is sort of piping in. So slowly but surely, we're developing this quilt of different regulations that we have to track at the state level and the federal level. And then, of course, other countries are doing the same thing, and they're coming out. China's coming out with its own. Argentina's coming out with its own. Russia's coming out with its own. And it's all just happening at the same time, and it can be a little bit daunting. Canada, for years we've known about Canada's PIPEDA, which we were very comfortable with, but now Canada is introducing new privacy legislation, updating PIPEDA to more closely align with the European requirements. And again, right there at the bottom, you see another sampling of other countries that are coming up with draft legislation, not just around privacy, but around information governance. So along with all this, privacy compliance is a must-have component for your information governance program. In laws such as PIPEDA or Canada's next version of PIPEDA, GDPR, CCPA are also requiring a complex, increasingly complex and complete response, because you're not just saying to the authorities, this is how long we're keeping it. This is also saying, not only are we keeping it, but then we're disposing of anything else that's not required within our systems. So the stakes are pretty high when it comes to establishing compliance and basically taking your own medicine when you draft these policies. You can't just pay lip service to a retention policy. It has to be properly vetted. So as you work on building this, your retention schedule is the start. Your retention schedule is your first line of defense, basically, because that's where you say, this is these are the rules that dictate what we must keep and for how long, so that everything else within our systems can be disposed of, so that we can deal with those biometric laws, biometric data retention laws, those privacy retention laws, so that we're not keeping stuff longer than we have to, and we can use what we have to keep as the first line of defense for justifying where we're keeping something what some authorities may seem like an unusually long amount of time. So a hazardous exposure record that has to be retained for termination of the employee plus 40 years, that is your first line of defense. It has to be retained because there's a law that says that we have to keep it for that long, even though it contains all kinds of private medical information, or it contains financial information, or it could even contain biometric information. So that's how you resolve the conflict between the edict of the privacy laws that are telling you dispose of the data as soon as you no longer need it, with the requirements, the legal requirements that tell you how long you need to keep it. So that's where Virgo steps in. Tina?
Yeah, before we jump forward, there was a good question that came through that's on the topic you were just covering. Do you think public agencies in California will eventually become responsible to the CCPA guidelines?
That's a really good question. Right now, under both CCPA and CPRA, public companies and nonprofits are exempted from it. But when you're saying public companies, you're talking about government agencies or government, government types of companies. So there's going to be a set of rules around the management of private data for government types of entities, but that's in the works. Right now, CPRA and CCPA just focus on public companies that are in the private sector, basically, but not for government agencies or nonprofits. Good question.
All right, well, I'll take over from here and kind of get us started on some survey information and some poll questions. But first, I wanted to quickly cover Virgo. We've kind of talked about it briefly. John did a quick introduction there at the beginning, but I recently presented a very similar presentation a couple weeks ago, and we kind of got to the data, and people were asking, we wanted to know more about Virgo, and I'll keep it at a very high level. Virgo is a cloud-based solution. It's a software as a service platform. It can be accessed really anywhere at any time through the web services or any web browser. Single sign-on options are available, very easy to access, very intuitive platform that a lot of our customers use to manage their retention schedules, because they're managing a lot of information, whether they be small single state organizations all the way to companies that may have multinational areas of operations across the world. And we service 140 countries with legal research and have a database of roughly 200,000 citations and growing. So being able to have a citation database that is customized and configured to each customer really does help benefit their efforts and reviews on maintaining an adequate and comprehensive policy. And being able to socialize this across the organization by generating custom departmental schedules or functional schedules and publishing that into an employee portal, of which we'll actually see some data that points that this is still kind of a big struggle that we're seeing. So it's a live feed, very easy to access, because even though we're managing retention schedules, the employees of the organization are not going to reference a particular code. They're going to be thinking about particular documents. So we want to make sure that that's understandable, building in a kind of a search engine database for them to understand their regulatory requirements and improve compliance across the organization. So Virgo, cloud-based solution, tailor-made research database to each customer, multiple different ways to export information to different systems and so forth. So at a high level, that's what Virgo is, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about it in the next few slides, or I may bring it up. If there are any additional questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to answer them throughout the call.
Yeah, I'd like to point out, because I don't like it when I attend sessions where I feel like I'm being sold a product, especially when it's a learning session. We're only using Virgo as an example. There are other providers in this space. I believe Iron Mountain has a product, Zazio has a product, and they may have different capabilities, but this is the one that we're using because it's the one that I helped create and I'm most familiar with. But just know that what we're going to talk about in terms of the ROI and the rest of this presentation is what you should be able to get out of some of the other products that are on the market.
Correct. And I think the next slide here is our first poll question.
So the question is, have protection and privacy concerns increased your organization's appetite for destroying unnecessary records and information?
Let's give them about 15 to 20 more seconds for everybody to kind of answer here. Pretty easy, straightforward for the most part, and we'll be able to compare our notes here on this this question for the next slide.
While we're waiting on that, there's a Q&A here. Does Virgo also track files, paper, and electronic, or is it just for retention schedules?
Good question. So we manage the policy for the retention, but we manage it for not just the retention schedule, but also the inventory that maps into that retention schedule, the inventory of repositories where all the data could be contained, and of course, all the global law. So we see it as a single point of truth for the management of the repositories, the content types or records inventory, the laws, and the retention schedule, all kind of interrelated in one single platform. Yes, that makes the answer to the poll makes a lot of sense. 74%. I'd actually be curious to hear from the 26%. It could be that maybe they don't feel that they're as regulated in the privacy space.
Could be. But if you advance to the next slide here, you'll be pleasantly surprised to see that the percentages align exactly correct at a 74%. So it's very consistent. And just a little bit of background on what we did to get these numbers is we actually surveyed 100 executives in IT, financial services, food, cosmetics, oil and gas, energy, highly regulated organizations. We did these over the phone. We actually spoke to the individuals themselves and asked them questions that we're going to be reviewing here. And we targeted companies with 500 million to 5+ billion in global sales, so high growth, highly regulated industries. So gathering a good amount of information for mature programs, so this should point to the best results. And as you can see here, 74%, it aligns exactly with a much larger range since there's roughly 250 people in this call. It's always great to see that. But they all agreed information protection and privacy concerns have increased the organization's appetite for destroying necessary records and information. So it's good to see that there's some consistency there. This is a kind of a driving force for our conversations and topics in 2021. So this is great to see that this is something that we as a service provider can start to cater to and have more of these detailed conversations with this information. So thank you all for answering this. John, go to the next slide here. And what we're going to talk about are the kind of additional considerations that we gathered from these interviewees. So almost all said that over retention of information is also a top concern because there is a liability and breach risk, both for physical and digital records. Obviously with the pandemic, the offices have been shut down, at-home work demand, access to information. So there's just a massive push for paper records cleanup, scanning, and digitization. And there's also many inefficiencies of duplicating information, and these efforts really exist across the company. So these are also important topics that we gathered from the survey, and over half of them also said that they don't have a reliable records inventory. They don't know the record types, the locations, the owners, or even the destruction dates. They have their information spread over millions of boxes and way more than 20 systems of record. What we find is oftentimes when our customers engage in implementing our solution, and they map in their documents from the retention schedule to the repositories within the organization, we find some of them have several dozen to well over 100 repositories of record that they're having to manage that they didn't necessarily know that they had at the time. But it's great to have a collaborative platform so you can start to have those conversations and everything's presented intuitively and it makes sense. So what we also try to achieve and improve on is that many companies are still struggling to prove that the records policies comply with the thousands of federal, state, provincial laws and regulations where they operate. Again, just pointing this out, domestic companies are subject to 8,000 to 15,000 requirements, and global companies could be 30,000 or more. And that's just a hefty feat for people to actually review. We'll get into kind of the effort in terms of time and money here in a few slides. But we want to try to improve this. These are consistent needs for a lot of the customers that I speak to. We obviously want to get away from doing these as a manual process and spreadsheets and email communications and so forth. So these are all big kind of topics that I see week in and week out with a lot of the different individuals that I talk to. So it's good to report on this. And I think this just goes into helping to build a business case and create some conversations within an organization. So John, you want to briefly talk about the additional considerations when we're looking for solutions in the market?
Yeah, and as the bottom of the slide says, regardless of what your solution is, it must include privacy requirements. You must be tracking the privacy requirements right now because the privacy requirements have very specific edicts around disposition of the data once it's no longer needed. They don't want that stuff around. There's two reasons. There's two primary drivers in the privacy regulations. The one driver is around the security, right? The security of the information. So the more the information is around, the more robust your program needs to be around protection of that data. So New York, for example, in the SHIELD Act, the focus of the SHIELD Act in New York is all about security and making sure that you have the proper processes in place to protect the data. But then there are more robust regulations or broader regulations that are saying it's not just about security, it's also about giving the consumer control of their data, giving the consumer the right to say, I want my data back, or I want the right to be forgotten and all that. So you need to be ready to provide that data back to them, but at the same time, have a defense for saying, well, we can't just give it back to you because we have a regulatory requirement under our retention schedule to maintain the data. So one of the things when you're considering your solution is you need to kind of be doing an assessment of everything that you need. So you need to identify the systems and the physical repositories where that information is contained, where your private information is contained. And then as you identify each of those systems, then you look and analyze or assess within the systems whether or not you have the ability to segregate that personal information within those systems. And then within your retention schedule, identify the series or content types or examples of records in your retention schedule that would be considered high risk as you're kind of baking that in. And then identify the record series and business owners and stakeholders that need to be maintained and informed in all this. So you need to have a single point of truth where all of this data is almost on a dashboard for you to be able to see where all this stuff and this type of information is being maintained. And again, privacy is just an example. There's also legal holds that you have to be very mindful of. There's also compliance, audits, availability of information that you need to be mindful of. But now we're using kind of privacy because it's basically the flavor du jour as sort of an example for a driver that we could use to put these programs forward. Dion, next question.
All right, poll question number 2. Do you currently have an adequate and comprehensive policy to tag and organize records according to current retention and destruction requirements? Yes or no?
And while you're answering that question, Wendy, any questions from the audience?
There are quite a few questions from the audience. I'm gonna pick one that's just sort of fun and not specific. There's a question asking you, John, does the 7-year retention policy wives' tale? Does that come from anything specific? Maybe the financial records or tax return records, anything having to do with the IRS? Do you know the genesis of that wives' tale?
I don't know the genesis of the wives' tale, but I can only assume that it could be related to the IRS. I mean, there is a retention requirement of 7 years. That's, and if you think about it, for years we were primarily concerned around the retention of our tax records, tax supporting records. That was the agency that we were most afraid of getting audited by. But as you start going deeper, so for the broader public, right? So there is a 7-year requirement in there. Sarbanes-Oxley has a 7-year requirement as well, which it kind of goes back to the early 2000s with the Enron scandal and all that. Dodd-Frank and all these sort of regulations that have been created. They do seem to have a common denominator of 7 years, but it just happens to be almost like when you roll the dice, 7 is the most commonly occurring number. But when you look at the full universe of regulations, and we manage, over 230,000 of them, you'll see that it's just a statistical number that appears most often, but it's not the end all be all.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, 50-50 on this one. Tidon, how does that compare with previous polls?
Got a split. The yeses are a little lower for this one, but kind of to be expected with a bigger audience list. So what we're looking at here is additional kind of research for the survey that we did. We spoke to the same 100 people. 83% of the executives that we spoke to that are responsible for records believe that they have a written and adequate comprehensive policy to tag and organize those records according to their best knowledge of current retention and destruction requirements. That's actually one of my favorite slides, and this has actually been consistent with the 2 other previous surveys that we completed. So this has been consistent for 3 years now, and it's been roughly about 80 to 85%, with a very small number in talking about the 83% believe that only 6% of the rank and file employees comply with records management requirements. That is a big drastic change. So they're putting a lot of effort and emphasis on building out the retention schedule, but the organization isn't necessarily in compliance. And we tried to improve this by offering an employee portal that allows the end users to actually go and search by familiar words and terms that they're going to be using on a day-to-day basis. 1099 reports, audit status logs, I-9s, employee termination documents, and things of that nature that they see on a day-to-day basis, because they're not going to be looking at it as a retention code, because that's what we're building as records management professionals. And we're putting a lot of emphasis on this in terms of all of the legal research and management of the schedule, ongoingly updating it, developing, consolidating, big bucketing, and so forth. There's a lot of effort going around it. We want to try to improve kind of the back end. The next step is trying to socialize it with the organization and get everybody on board with improving compliance as a whole. So 94% of the companies we spoke to, they stated that they are performing most records management tasks manually still. And with so many solutions on the market that are readily available to assist in a lot of these challenges and tasks, it's going to be kind of a growing pain, but we're moving slowly into more of a digital era. So it's good to see that these numbers kind of pointed out as still kind of a challenge that we have room to build upon.
Next poll question. Is that me? Oh, there we go. Thanks.
So considering all strategies your organization has implemented, which strategy for disposing of electronic records has been the most successful? You have a couple of options here. Cloud solution, annual IG RIM training for all employees, clearly defined policies and supporting procedures, records coordinators roles, tighter retention controls on non-records, annual certifications, and just making disposal a part of a much larger effort, such as due diligence, business restructuring, or IT initiatives. Right. So John, what are your thoughts on these? Have you seen these over many years? What do you see most customers kind of turning towards? What do you feel is going to be the big answer here?
I would have picked all of the above. I've seen all of them, and I've seen many of them being used very effectively. And I would say that cloud solutions have varying degrees of success. But it's not fully automated yet by any stretch of the imagination. So it is really a combination of all of these.
Yeah.
And let's see what are our results, Tito?
Yeah. There we go. Cloud solution at 9%, annual RIM training 4%, clearly defined policies at 25%. Records coordinators roles at 24, tighter retention controls for non-records, smaller. And then the 29% is making disposal part of a much larger effort. So all great answers. I don't think there's a wrong answer here, but we obviously wanted to generate kind of some additional information and data from your responses on top of what we have considered as a part of our smaller research survey that we completed over the past few months. So let's shift forward to the next slide, John.
Okay.
All right. So we asked the same question to the other 100 in the survey. Their big answer was clearly defined policies and supporting procedures, and all the other ones kind of fell in line here. We filtered they're in order. So the first one being the clearly defined policies, and then cloud solution coming in second, and annual IG RIM training coming in third. So they're 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way down. Which is a little bit different from what we just got, but that's why we wanted to survey, just to understand where everybody was coming from. We have a much larger audience. We have people from all around the globe. So it's great to have your responses. We really appreciate you providing this. If there's any additional questions or any additional thoughts around this, maybe you have a different strategy within your organization. If you do, feel free to let us know. We'd be happy to kind of add this into our considerations going forward in the surveys. We're always trying to develop and improve and understand our customers and their needs. So, as we're going through this, if you have ideas, please let us know. All right. Well, we are finally to the heart of the presentation. This is something I've been working on for several months. Being in sales, it's my job to help my customers build a business case and develop a relationship with them on understanding their specific needs and requirements. As an organization, looking at records management, trying to understand, their struggles on managing so much information throughout the year. And one of the things that I would always say is, the Virgo solution and most other solutions come in at a much lower cost than performing this work in-house or outsourcing to a consultancy firm or a law firm. And Virgo was built out of John doing this work for his customers in an Excel spreadsheet, and it just got to be too tedious and hard and difficult to manage everything in a spreadsheet. So that's when he paired up with the other co-founder and built Virgo. And a lot of customers appreciate having such an intuitive platform to be able to manage so much information all in one place. So as we're going through this, and we can jump to the next slide, John. One thing I kind of run into, and John can kind of speak to this a little bit, is I had this idea and I was like, I want to run with it, but there's so many variables that go into this. I had John, I had other colleagues, they were like, we don't know where you're going with this, but we support you. Let's see if you can do it. And so obviously every organization is going to be a little bit different. Their teams are going to be managed by a various number of people. There's so many variables that go into the consideration of trying to build a cost analysis, just because there's so many things that could be different for each company. So what I specifically did is, since I'm familiar with the Virgo product, I've broken the pricing up into essentially 6 phases that you see here on the right side of the screen. And these are the phases that we normally structure our project plans for Virgo. So we start with a regulatory scope, project kickoff. We discuss regulatory research. So with each customer, we don't provide access to all 200,000 citations because many of them aren't going to be relevant for your organization. We subset that information based on your responses from a customized regulatory research questionnaire, which is about 125 questions, very easy to do, usually takes our customers about a day to understand. But what we've been able to uncover with a lot of our customers with that questionnaire is discovering private airline fleets that customers didn't know that they needed to include in the retention schedule. We had one customer, it's a telecommunications company, that found out they had a nuclear power plant that they were managing that wasn't in the retention schedule at the time. So we needed to add in that legal research. So we try to uncover as much as we can and only provide you the information that's relevant to the schedule. And that's when we go through developing the retention schedule, mapping in those regulations. So you don't actually have to go in and perform any manual work. With our solution, we break these up into phases and essentially present you with an updated schedule mapped into a database of citations. And this is essentially what all solutions kind of in our market are performing to some degree. But for me to go into this, I had to kind of add some parameters around it so I could build out some numbers. So when we look at these, we won't get too kind of in detail into the project plan, but I did break it out on the different business roles that you see here on the first bullet. So the salary and fee rates are based on business roles. So records manager, corporate lawyer, corporate paralegal, outside counsel paralegal, and project manager. Given that could be different for your company, there could be many more individuals that are going to be involved. I wanted to try to keep it as simple as I could. So I've only included 4 at a time as I reviewed this. And these are all based on how we perform our work and how quickly as a solution provider we can update the schedule. And then from there, I needed to understand what scope I wanted to provide. So we're looking at US, which is US plus 51 states, including DC. And then we'll have kind of a global scope of work that is the US plus 24 additional countries. So on average, that's just kind of what I felt was going to be best here, very easy. So again, I'm building some parameters. These might fluctuate for the organization. I've built these out customized to some of our customers, and they do fluctuate depending on your areas of operation. So I wanted to set some context here that these are assumptive numbers that I've built out as estimations just to help with discussional purposes. So let's go into the first one. So this is going to be United States in-house versus outsourced. We're going to jump into one more poll question, the very final poll question. I know some of you probably are a little tired of answering, but we want to try to keep you engaged and interactive here. So let's pull up this question. How much do you think it costs on average to refresh and update a United States only retention schedule each year? So you have 5 answers here: less than 25,000, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 150, and over 150,000. So we'll give everybody a little bit of time. John, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think is going to be the big answer here?
I think that it depends on, well, when you say United States only, you're talking about federal only or all 50 states?
United States, and we'll federal and in all 51 states.
Oh, 50, yeah, because you were saying your assumption was 51, including DC.
Right.
I think that the United States alone is a substantial lift. And then the other question I would have is whether or not we're talking about the cost here. We're talking about fully burdened cost.
Yep.
And here's the results. Wow.
So tied 25 to 50, 5100. And this is very consistent with the last poll that we did. It fell within this time frame. The 50 to 100,000 was the higher of the two last time, but they're very, very similar. So it's good to see some consistency there.
Also good to see that Wendy's back from the upside down.
Yes, I got power back, and but I wanted to pop in here not only to tell you guys that I'm safe and I have power, but to just bring out, did anybody else catch that when Tidon asked John for information right then, the typical attorney response was the first thing out of his mouth, it depends, right? And then he started asking questions. And I just love that about, you know, how we are working through this, that there's plenty of information, but there's even more questions. So I just want to let you guys know that there are lots of questions in the Q&A section. I'm trying to hold them more to the end because they're a little bit more about Virgo, and then there are also some really generic retention schedule kind of questions. But I want you to know that there's a ton of questions, and so hopefully we'll have some time for that.
So how about we tackle it this way? I will cover all of these as long as John can kind of fast forward me through each slide, and I'll let him do some of the Q&A, and then we'll open it up for kind of live commentary at the end. Does that work?
Works for me.
All right, perfect. So what we're looking at here, again, it's the data that I compiled as estimations. What we found is that based on my review and updates and kind of dedication to understanding the different cost analysis for the different roles, we're looking at the in-house investment for US update. So I think, John, you might have forwarded on accident. This one's outsourced. I need to go back one. There we go. So I also broke this up into a 3-month effort and a 9-month effort, only on the premise that it takes us about 3 months to implement a US only schedule. That will fluctuate dependent on each customer, obviously, but that's just kind of a good range that we see on average. But we can also estimate that if you don't use a solution and you're doing it manually, that it could potentially take you 1.5 to 3 times longer to perform this work. And obviously, the more time it takes, the more expensive it gets in terms of legal research. So you really see the big kind of bold blue sticking out here, which is the corporate lawyer fees. And this is based on the role itself and the time frame that we dedicate to performing regulatory research and updating it for the Virgo solution. And then the orange line is essentially just showing you the different savings for each year. So on average, you're going to be looking at $150,000 for a manual 3-month effort. Whereas if you perform it over 9 months, it could potentially cost you over $200,000 to perform an update to the US. And again, there are many other factors that go into this. And this is just looking at kind of soft dollars. Whereas a solution here, just an expedited solution effort, would be about roughly $35,000 on an annual basis or less. So, you know, you can see the kind of differentiators. And as we move to the next slide, we're going to look at outsourcing it and seeing the big difference here. Obviously, when you outsource, especially to law firms and consultants groups, they usually charge a little bit more per hour. So these numbers will get a little bit more hefty. John, can you forward us? I know you're probably answering questions. Thank you. So as you see here, these numbers spiked up a little bit more on this. Obviously, again, those hourly rates jumped up because we're outsourcing it not to a solution, but to a different firm to perform that legal research. So again, looking at a 3-month manual effort versus a 9-month manual effort, anywhere from roughly $80,000 to over $500,000 over a year period, if we're wanting to update and give a comprehensive approach. So, you know, just having those numbers there to help you guide you and understand that this is a hefty investment. And this is just a time, we're really looking at a time investment here for these individuals to perform their duties on updating the schedules, whereas a solution provider such as Virgo and Access We do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so it does reduce not only the complexity, but it reduces the cost because it's a shared service. So let's jump forward to the next slide. John, we're going to be looking at some cost savings over a 3, 5, and 10-year period. So what you're looking at here on the screen is, we want to talk about savings rather than domestically insourcing it. So you see here, savings in the first year range from $45,000 to $203,000. And over a 10-year period, that number goes up. So roughly $500,000 to $2 million over a 10-year period. And these numbers should really stand out in understanding that, these practices of communicating through email and spreadsheets, it's a very tedious and complex thing to manage manually, whereas solutions make this a much more intuitive process. It'll help you get through that work much more quickly and make it much more easier to understand, on top of the ROI and the cost savings for subscribing to a solution. And then when we jump to the next slide, you can see again, these numbers for outsourcing will dramatically jump because of those big price increases. So this one is going to be, on just the first year, there's $146,000 in savings. And then looking at a manual effort for 9 months, it could be roughly $500,000. So that big range of $150,000 to $500,000 in 1 year, it's very stark. And when I started to put these numbers together, it really did stand out to me that these are important things to be discussing as we're moving forward in kind of the digital era. So when we start to look at, how much savings do we have over a given period of time? Let's look at the scope of a 10-year period so we can see these numbers and what that looks like.
Hey, Don, there's a real specific question that fits in right here. And the question is, are these costs based on a net new retention schedule versus a refresh to a retention schedule?
So these are based on developing a new retention schedule. And this is how we have essentially done it, because we see a lot of customers, probably about 80% of our customer base has specifically requested and needed a big bucket approach. So development of the retention schedule, because many of them, they just have such a large amount of record series and different codes. They want to consolidate it down to a much more manageable number. And we've been able to do that with a lot of customers. So when I built this, I said, you know what, we see more of our customer base currently kind of asking for this. So let's build this number in. So again, these are estimations for updating and developing the retention schedule and refreshing here. These will fluctuate a little bit, but I at least wanted to kind of get some estimation. So hopefully that kind of answers your question there. It really is not necessarily building from scratch, but we want to take the current work that you have and supplement it with best practices and our current knowledge with our attorney team and update the schedule from there.
I would add to that, for some customers, they may think it's a refresh, but it's actually an overhaul. So an overhaul of a retention schedule it is like starting from scratch, and many customers have to overhaul because to adapt to best practices and changes to the big bucket schedule and all that stuff. They may have something that was working, but it actually needs to be overhauled so that it can be brought up to more 21st century standards.
Yep. All right. I know we have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to try to breeze through these. It's all essentially the same information. I've just expanded the scope of work to cover 25 countries. So let's take a look at in-house versus outsourced. These numbers are going to be a lot higher because we're looking at a much larger jurisdictional scope of work to perform legal research for. You can see here that usually on average, most of these global implementations take about 8 months to perform. And there are essentially cost savings here, even on the first year. So for what we're seeing and kind of what I've invested my time in here too, found that it's about $200,000 for a global update if performing it in-house. If it's a 12-month effort, it could be upwards of $300,000. And then for an expedited solution effort, we're estimating about $160,000. And this is, again, updating that schedule, getting it in place. The subscription services are going to be a much lower portion, but I wanted to build that in there to show you that even with implementation costs and subscription costs, it still comes in at a much more manageable number and investment than trying to perform a $200,000 update every single year and develop it and kind of what John was talking about. So jump to the next slide for me, John.
Just to clarify, Tidon, so you picked 8 months and 12 months because 8 months is typically how long it takes a company with, say, 24 countries to do their update manually. And then you did the 12 months because companies want to see what an annualized cost would be.
Correct.
And then if it took, basically all year to do it versus the third number, the expedited solution effort, which would mean using a company like Iron Mountain or Zazio or Virgo to help them with the updates.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
Absolutely. You got it. So all the same thing here, just looking at outsourced for this 8-month effort, this number jumps up even higher here. $450,000 investment over 8-month period, all the way up to could potentially be $700,000 investment. And this is, again, back to those legal research fees. And, these individuals may still dedicate the same amount of time in terms of a records manager, a paralegal, a project manager to implement a solution. But you can see those numbers are very small in comparison to an outside counsel research and their efforts that go into this. And this is essentially where the savings really come from, is because we manage a very large database of citations that we curate and update throughout the year for all of our customers. So they're constantly informed of new updates to legal research, not only for retention, but for privacy and access, disposition, location, language, and format requirements, and so forth. And those all have to be a part of the considerations as we're looking at updating these retention schedules, because as John mentioned earlier, they are very complex. There are new things that we kind of never imagined would be a part of building in retention schedules that we're now having to do because they're a part of the requirements that we have to manage every year. And I know we're coming short on time, so let's finish these last 3 slides, John. And again, these are just looking at kind of cost savings over a 10-year period. So this one's going to range anywhere from 30,000 to 130, all the way up to 302,000 to 1.2 million. And those numbers really just stand out to me. And I feel if you present this to management team and say, hey, we can save potentially $1.2 million over a 10-year period, we need to subscribe to some tool to perform this. That's going to get the attention of them. And if that doesn't, I'm not sure what does. I mean, there are probably other things that are in consideration, but this should definitely help to build a business case and getting that conversation going, because every organization is wanting to save money. And if you start to get into the millions, that's going to create some conversation. So when we look at outsourcing here on the next slide, these are the even more hefty numbers. And these are the ones that kind of blew me out of the water when I started to do this. So savings, 300,000 to 450,000 on average for even just the first year. And if you start to subscribe to a tool, you can save anywhere from $3 to $4.5 million over a 10-year period. And that is just a stark contrast. And I think that has a huge benefit into trying to at least invest some time in understanding, what is the right tool for us? What fits within our organization? What can we use this tool for to help not only improve the business users side of it, but improve compliance across the organization as a whole? All right, John, I know we have two minutes. I want to spend a little bit of time. I don't want to dig too much into Virgo, but I want to answer some of these questions that we have before people start dropping off.
There's a question here that's, probably good at this point. Mm-hmm. There's someone that's asking, what advice can you give to a global company with a presence in many countries in deciding which countries to research for? I have my answer, which is you have to look at all of them. But I'm curious how you guys would answer, because their point is this could be really important to the ROI of the project if you have lots of countries that you have to research for. Is it ever possible to just target rather than do them all?
Yes, your instinct is right. I mean, in an ideal world, you would look at all of them. But we do have some customers that are in 200 countries, for example. And it would just starts to get a little cost prohibitive. Not that we can't handle it, but it does get cost prohibitive. So what we do is we say, Rome wasn't built in a day. Let's not try to tackle, because there's always going to be budgetary constraints. Let's not try to tackle all 200 countries at once. Let's prioritize the countries based on the sensitivity of the operations that you've got going in that country, or where you may not have that much going there, but you know that there's going to be future big operations there. How much is that country breathing down your neck right now? All considerations that are baked into sort of the initial determination of which countries to tackle first. And then there are certain countries that I would consider high watermark countries, that if you have a presence in those countries in terms of operations, in other words, you have employees that are there, and usually we say more than 10 employees in that country, we want to be paying special attention to those countries. Germany comes to mind, for example, as being highly regulated. Canada is very highly regulated. Of course, the US, China is starting to come up with some really onerous regulations. So again, we prioritize based on our experience of what we think are the countries that are high watermark, combined with the geographic footprint of the organization and where they have seen in their own experience the countries that have been most troublesome for them. Good question.
Now, were there more to the slides? Because we are right at the top of the hour. I know there are lots of questions in the Q&A, and I also know that Tidon is answering some of those right now. And if I understand correctly, we can continue to answer those after this is over, or you can reach out to Tidon for more information. There were really some great questions in here that unfortunately I think would probably take us another 30 minutes to get to.
Yeah, there's really great questions here, and having such a big audience, we knew there would be great questions, and we will certainly answer these as best we can and get back to everybody on these questions. I know, yeah, they're going to take a little bit of time to kind of get through all really awesome questions, and definitely want to answer them. Wendy or Jennifer, will we be sending out like an email address for individuals to potentially contact me if they do have questions, or would you like me to put that in the chat, or is there a window for that?
We can include some information in our post email that goes out after the event, but if you also want to pop it into the chat, that's definitely encouraged.
Okay, then I will do that, make it a little bit easier for everybody, but that will definitely put it in the email notification so people can contact me directly should they have any questions. You know that, Marcus.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you, John and Tidon, for this great information. I loved seeing the actual numbers, and this is something that I tried to do myself when I was looking at a project like this, and these numbers are even better than I put together. So thank you for that and for spending your time with us today. Everybody that's still on the call, remember, if you want to see these guys live and in person, there's always the Houston InfoCon coming this fall. So I hope to see everyone there. Thanks again, and have a fantastic day.